Hello and welcome. You've found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listeners. Jonathan here. As a social work practitioner, educator, and researcher, I find it really frustrating when social work programs talk about evaluating practice only in the context of large, expensive, multi-year research projects that require really complicated statistics, because 99% of social workers will never be part of that. Social workers graduate thinking that research is something that doesn't apply to practice. Well, today's episode is the first of a two-part series on research design that I hope will debunk some of those myths. My guest, Dr. Bruce Thayer, is the distinguished research professor and former dean with the College of Social Work at Florida State University. And I spoke with Bruce in fall 2023 for today's episode on single system design, also referred to as single subject design. And then for part two, we spoke in the winter of 2024 about experimental design. Now, Bruce never calls single system design revolutionary, but I think it could be. Consider this: a group home for individuals with schizophrenia, a staff member desperate to improve residents' physical activity, and a single stationary bike. With just a little data, the first two letters of the alphabet, and a bit of creativity, Bruce helped transform that scenario into a success story that not only improved the lives of the clients, but also debunked myths about serious mental illness and exercise. Now, single system design isn't flashy, but as Bruce tells us, it's the kind of simple innovation that can help social workers evaluate practice in a way that's rigorous, practical, and client-centered. We start our conversation diving into why social workers should know about single system design, its core components, and the kinds of measures and assessments that work best and where to find them. We discuss real-world examples, the nuances of designs like AB, ABC, and beyond, and how to use single subject designs for complicated, multi-layered problems, the kind of realistic issues that clients come to us with. Now, I wanted to know if single system designs worked across levels of practice, micro, mezzo, and macro, and whether they're appropriate for evaluating evidence-based practice. And when I told Bruce that I had concerns about the generalizability of single system designs, he reminded me that the requirements for generalizability are almost never met, even in the kinds of rigorous, large-scale studies that I mentioned at the top of the episode. We ended with a discussion about publishing single system designs. Now, in part two, which is episode 144, Bruce and I talk about why social workers at the BSW, MSW, and doctoral level should understand, and in the right situations, use experimental research design. He points out that social workers started publishing experimental designs in the 1940s, which is around the same time as psychologists and sociologists. And he distinguished quasi-experimental from experimental design and why the, quote, natural experiment, end quote, of COVID doesn't really count as experimental design. A lot of the work that he was referring to comes from his 2023 text, Experimental Research Designs in Social Work: Theory and Applications, published through Columbia University Press. And now, without further ado, on to episode 143 of the Social Work Podcast, The Power of One, Single System Design with Bruce Thayer. Bruce, thank you so much for being here on the Social Work Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, why should social workers know about single system design?
Well, I would think that every social worker would like to have some type of empirical evidence on the outcomes of their own practice. And I note that the NASW Code of Ethics says that we're ethically obligated to evaluate the outcomes of our own practice, and that applies to people at the BSW, MSW, and doctoral levels. Also, the Council on Social Work Education says that we need to teach students how to evaluate methods, how to use methods of evaluation for their own practice in the BSW and the MSW program.
So it's both an ethical obligation and also, in terms of our accreditation and sort of the educational standards, it's explicitly mentioned for MSW and BSW.
And very much so. And in fact, evaluation of practice is the only research skill that the Council on Social Work Education requires that we teach students to do. All the other research methods we teach them can be taught for the students to be able to consume them, to be able to read them and understand them.
So it's really interesting to think about single system design as something that can sort of fulfill that ethical obligation to evaluate practice. Because a lot of what we talk to students about when they're going through their MSW or their BSW are these kind of off-the-shelf interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy or manualized treatments and things like that. Is single system design something that you could use with one of these off-the-shelf manualized interventions, or is it something different?
I think that single system designs can be used for any type of intervention that's actually expected to change the lives of the people that we work with.
So what are the components of a single system design?
Well, there's only four. And the first is that we have to develop or locate some type of reliable and valid measure of client functioning. It can be a problem like a score on the Beck Depression Inventory. It can be a behavior like drinking too much. It can be a physiological variable like high blood pressure or perhaps being overweight. The second prerequisite is to ask the client to complete this measure, and you can have more than one, repeatedly over time. And ideally, you do that before you begin intervention or treatment, and then you continue that evaluation in the same way during intervention, and you graph the data, and then you share the data with the client and make any inferences that you can visually detect. You don't need statistics to evaluate single subject designs. All you need is a pair of eyeballs and be able to draw a conclusion. Yes, they got better, or it's obvious they didn't get better, or it's obvious that they got worse.
So the measurement, it seems like a really important piece to this, right? Knowing what it is that you're measuring and being able to see change on those scores. Are there any types of measures or assessments that you think work better or that are sort of more appropriate for single system design?
I think that question needs to be tailored to the needs of the individual client. There's really only three things we can possibly measure when we're assessing client functioning. One is the client's self-report of their feelings or thoughts. A second is that we can measure their actual behavior. And the third is that we could conceivably measure some type of physiological aspect of their functioning, such as a drug urine test or something like that.
So you have this ethical obligation. You want to do the best you can for your clients. First of all, where do you find measures to use? How does one find that?
Well, as you know, there's a great book called The Handbook of Measures for Social Work Research and Practice by David Springer, Kevin Corcoran, and Joel Fisher. It's been around through multiple editions, and it contains literally hundreds of examples of high quality, what we call rapid assessment instruments that measure virtually everything under the sun, from individual behavior to families to couples to marriages. That's a good source that could be on the shelf, and I think every agency should get that book. Another way is we can use a literature search device like, say, PsycInfo or Web of Science and type in a phrase like depression and then qualify it with things like rating or scale or measurement. And with a little bit of searching, you can find previously published measures that are reliable and valid for just about every kind of outcome we might think of in social work.
So what's an example of a single system design? Can you describe something that illustrates the kind of problem that you might use single system design with, or a situation and how it works?
Well, let's take somebody, like myself. I was interested in losing weight. So I measured my weight for a number of weeks on a weekly basis, or even more frequently than that. And then I began a formal weight reduction program, and I graphed the results, and I was able to see that with the weight program I was on, I was actually losing weight over a number of months. And over time, I dropped about 30 pounds. And that would be a type of design we would call an A-B design, A referring to a baseline, pre-treatment measures of client functioning or behavior or some other aspect of their well-being. And then the B phase would refer to the intervention phase, hence A, baseline, and then B is the intervention phase.
And so I love that you used the example of yourself and measuring your weight and then doing the intervention. For the A-B design, are there different designs? Like, is there an ABC? Is there ABCD? Like, can you keep going down the alphabet? Or would it be in repeating the AB? How does that work?
There's a variety of single system or single subject research designs that can be done. The A-B is one of the simplest, but not quite the simplest. And then you can remove the intervention, and you would graph this in what we would call an ABA design. And this would be you remove the treatment after it's been implemented for a while to see if the client regresses or goes back to their initial baseline functioning. This can be good in terms of making causal inferences about the effects of treatment. It's not particularly good clinically, except in the situation where the client continues to improve even though you've discontinued treatment. That suggests that your intervention, if it was causally responsible for the improvement, is continuing to have an effect over a longer period of time.
Which seems like would be an ideal situation because you had an intervention and then you stopped and the person continued to get better or some outcome, which I think in some ways is what we want with our clients because we're not always going to be around to intervene.
Sure. And if you did, as an example, the ABA design and the client got worse or deteriorated, you could then reinstitute the initial treatment in the B phase and see if their functioning enhances. So that would be what would be called an AB-AB design. And the idea is that if you see a systematic change from the first baseline to the first treatment phase, and then a reversal from the first treatment phase to the second baseline, and then a reinstatement of improvement from the second treatment phase to the second baseline, that's very strong grounds for making a causal inference that the client got better because of the intervention you did. There's very few alternative explanations that could explain such a pattern apart from inferring that it was the treatment.
That's really impressive. And as you're saying that, I'm visualizing a chart, and I see the A, and then I see a line with the B, right? So it sort of distinguishes the baseline from the intervention. Then you got the intervention phase. Now, with social work, I think one of the things that I often think about the problems that people come to us with is that they tend to be complicated, right? There are multiple layers to what goes on. For a single system design, is there a way to set it up so that you can look at multiple interventions at the same time? Or is this something where you would intervene with one thing and then you would stop, you'd go to something else? Like, how does that work with a really complicated problem?
That's a great question. There's nothing to prevent you from using multiple interventions at the same time in the context of an A-B design. It does make it difficult to determine what element of the intervention package that you used was responsible for the improvement. But clinically, we don't care about that so much. We just want to see, can we gather evidence that the client really improved over time? And whether that be with using only one intervention or multiple interventions at the same time doesn't really matter. Or alternatively, you could do an A-B design and then add another A phase. And if they got worse, you could say, well, maybe they didn't get that much better during the first B phase. I'm going to try a different treatment for my next phase. And you would call this an A-B-A-C design. For example, let's say you're treating somebody with PTSD and you're measuring PTSD on a reliable and valid scale, of which many exist. You could baseline their functioning over time, and then do, let's say, progressive relaxation training. And they don't get very much better, but a little bit. Then you remove the relaxation training and they go back to the initial baseline, and you think, well, I can do better than that. I'm going to use something a little more sophisticated, let's say EMDR. And for the C phase, you would try EMDR and see if the client got more better with EMDR than they did with progressive relaxation training. So you can use it to evaluate a sequence of interventions and maybe even to compare the relative efficacy of one intervention over another.
I mean, that sounds very both practical but also sophisticated. And, I think one of the things about single system design that I think is so fascinating is that And you mentioned this. This is the kind of thing that, an everyday practitioner can and possibly should be using to evaluate practice.
I agree, but when I was in full-time practice, if I used a single system design to evaluate my work with 1 out of 10 clients, I thought I was doing pretty good. So I don't want to apply in any way, shape, or form that practitioners should use these designs with every one of their clients. But sometimes the opportunity arises to make use of it, and it's tremendously rewarding and clinically useful when it does.
Are there any problems or any levels of practice that you think single system design isn't really applicable or isn't really a good idea?
Not really. I think that if you look in the literature, you can find that single system research designs have been used across all levels of social work practice, evaluating clinical work with individuals, evaluating group work, evaluating community practice, and even in the evaluation of social welfare policy. In fact, single system research designs and a modification called time series designs are the primary method by which we evaluate social welfare policies. And to give you an example, let's say a state does not require motorcycle riders to wear a helmet. And you can get state statistics, these are already gathered, and look for let's say the 12-month pattern of monthly fatalities before a new law was passed requiring helmet use for motorcycle riders. And then you look at the pattern for the 12 months or so after the helmet law was introduced, and you'll be able to see pretty clearly whether or not motorcycle rider fatalities were reduced following the introduction of a helmet law. That's macro practice. That's evaluation of a health and social policy. And it's relatively easy to do and doesn't cost much money. You don't need grants to do single system design work.
I love that you gave a macro practice example, because I think that so often when I think about single system design, I do think about the one client sitting in my office, and I say, okay, so now we're going to do this, and we're going to see how it changes. Are there other examples of single system design that you think really kind of paint a picture of how it can be used, some different ways? Because I'm sure there are people listening who are like, oh, well, now that you say that, that would be really interesting. I think I'd like to try that.
Well, I can give an example early on in my career when I was a consultant for a group home, taking care of individuals with the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And the activity therapist called me one day and she said, Bruce, I can't get the residents to participate in an exercise program. They lead a pretty sedentary life. Most of them are heavily medicated and sort of lethargic throughout most of the day. And I've been trying to get them to participate with me in a morning aerobics program that's on TV, and they just won't do it. Can you come up with something to get them to exercise with me? And so I thought about it for a while, and I said, is it important to exercise with you or that they actually get in aerobic exercise? And she thought about it. She said, well, it's more important they exercise, whether it's with me or not. And I said, well, let's try this. Let's buy a used stationary bicycle with an odometer on it and put it in the TV room and invite the residents to use it whenever they wish, except ask the staff to record the time in terms of mileage of when the people began to ride the bike and when they didn't, and keep track of their mileage daily for a week or two. And then we'll implement a reinforcement program to see that when they complete riding a half a mile or a mile and a half, if that can improve the mileage that they ride every day. And we could try that for a week or so. And since it's not a life-threatening issue, we could deliberately plan to have a return to baseline condition. And for a week or two after that, go back to the reinforcement program. So we actually did this with 2 residents. Each was diagnosed with chronic mental illness. And they didn't ride the bike at all to speak of during the first week. And then we applied the reinforcer program, and they rode a lot compared to the first baseline. Then we discontinued the reinforcement program. And then we reinstated it in the 4th week. And at the end of the 4th week, one of the residents was riding 6 miles a day. And then we did follow-up a couple months later, and they both were still riding considerably above the baseline level. So that was a really nice design, and I actually was able to publish it with the activity therapist.
Wow. So there was this need to address aerobic activity. You had this AB design, or AB. Would that be an AB now that I'm saying that?
Yes, it would be.
And then you were even able to publish it. So journals are publishing single system design.
Yeah, they've been published in almost all the major social work journals, and also they've been published in the evaluation of almost all models of social work practice, even psychoanalysis, Rogerian counseling, EMDR, behavior analysis and therapy, family therapy, marital therapy. You can find examples of using these designs with virtually any practice model. Even qualitative approaches like narrative therapy have been evaluated using single subject designs.
So everything that we've been talking about is sort of a single system design. Is there ever a situation where you would have multiple single system designs, or you would use a single system design for multiple different people, with sort of the idea of kind of understanding how something affects multiple people?
Sure. There's a variation of single system designs. It's called a multiple baseline across clients design. And this would be where you'd have two or more individuals with the same problem that you're going to treat with the same type of therapy or intervention. You start baseline on both about the same time, and you go for a while with both, and then you implement the intervention with the first client, let's say after a week, but you continue baselining the second client. And what you're looking for, does the first client improve when they get intervention, and does the second client continue with a stable baseline? Then you introduce the same intervention after a longer baseline with client number 2 and see if they improved only after the intervention is applied. If you can do that with 2 people, that's great. If you can do it with 3, that's even better. And if you see 3 successive coincidental shifts of improvement in client 1 and client 2 and client 3 and so forth, you have pretty good grounds for causal inference in the sense of, yes, this intervention caused improvement. But I want to emphasize that we don't need to use single subject designs to demonstrate the causality of our interventions. I like to think of these designs being useful to answer 2 simple questions. The first is that, did the client improve? And we can answer that with an A-B design. It's relatively not difficult to do that. The more sophisticated question is, can we prove they got better because the intervention worked with them? And that requires an extended design like an AB-AB or a multiple baseline design of some type. So yeah, you can use these designs with multiple people at the same time. You can also use them, let's say, in a community setting. Let's say that there is a high rate of crime, and you got baseline statistic for that for a few months. And then there was a new type of policing that was instated, let's say community policing or something like that. And you see if the crime rate goes down after the new method of policing was introduced. So your unit of analysis are numbers of crimes per day or per week or per month extended over an A-B type of format. So that's how we can use these designs, let's say, for community practice.
So this seems like it would be pretty useful in, clinical practice, like as a clinician. Is this valuable in other areas of social work?
Well, sure, and not just clinical practice, but as I said, more macro levels as well. And this is very useful clinically and in all attempts when we're expecting to intervene at some level to see whether or not the situation has improved over time. Now, this can also be good in clinical supervision. So when your supervisor comes to see you, or you go see them and they say, how's your client doing? And you can say they're fine. Sometimes a supervisor, like me, would say, well, what evidence do you have? Where's your data? And if you can pull out a nice A-B design showing that the client's problem was high and stable, and then after you introduce the intervention, it fairly rapidly began to get better, that's a really impressive method that you can use in your own supervision. And in selected cases, some social workers take the extra step to write it up in the form of a formal publication or an article that they would submit to a professional journal. And if it gets accepted there, then you've started making a contribution to generalized knowledge that other people can read about what you've done and build upon it and extend it. Maybe they can take your technique that worked with one client population and use it with a different type of client population. And these designs are also very useful in terms of developing pilot data on evaluating, let's say, a novel treatment, a new intervention, a new therapy. And rather than trying to get a big grant and spending a lot of money with randomized controlled experiments and things like that, collect a series of single subject designs showing fairly consistent positive effects of the intervention, and then that can be used to submit with a research grant to justify a larger scale evaluation. It would be the height of folly to do a randomized controlled trial on a brand new intervention with no evidence at all besides anecdote that it really works. But if you can collect a series of single system or single subject studies, then the grounds for doing a larger scale group study are greatly enhanced. And sometimes these designs can be used if a student is undertaking either an MSW capstone project or a DSW capstone project or a PhD doctoral dissertation. These designs are widely used at Florida State University. We've had 6 or 7 students do single subject designs as their method of data analysis for their PhDs. My first doctoral student did her doctoral dissertation on teaching very young children to consistently use seatbelts. This was done before there were laws mandating seatbelt use. She trained the whole school. She got good data showing that seatbelt use was very low. And then when she did her intervention, which was a multi-component package, it immediately went up to near 100% compliance. And then when the program was discontinued after a few weeks, she went back a few months later when the program had been halted that whole period of time, and the seatbelt use of the kids was still very, very high. So dissertation research, DSW projects, MSW projects, all are grist for the mill for single system research designs.
Well, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about one of the things that we've talked about in the profession for years. I had Danielle Parrish come and talk about the process of evidence-based practice. And, if we think about the steps of evidence-based practice, there is that piece of it which says evaluate, right? So you need to evaluate practices. Is this something that you could use in the evaluation component of the process of evidence-based practice?
Yes, in the original book titled Evidence-Based Medicine, from which the model of evidence-based practice was derived from, they outline a 5-step process of evidence-based practice. And the first is to come up with an answerable question dealing with what the information needs you have to help your client and come up with some type of intervention. The second step is to track down the available best evidence you can find. The third step is to critically evaluate it. The fourth step is to summarize the results with your clients and with their consent, and if it's ethically suitable and you have the resources and so forth, actually apply the intervention with your client. And then the fifth step of evidence-based practice is to evaluate how well you did, both clinically and in terms of implementing the model. So evidence-based practice and single subject designs are completely consistent with each other, and the very book, Evidence-Based Medicine, has a whole chapter on using single subject designs to evaluate practices. The two go together very, very well.
One of the things that you mentioned was publishing the results of your single system design, and that one of the benefits is that somebody could read it and then say, I'm going to try this with my clients, with my population. Would you say that single system designs are generalizable? I know that is an issue that we talk about when we talk about different types of research methods, and single system design is quantitative, right? And that there are numbers, right? And we typically think of qualitative as not being generalizable, but as we're talking, I'm just wondering actually if folks consider single system design sort of to be the results to be generalizable.
Well, in my opinion, no single research finding is generalizable, whether it be single subject design or whether it be a group design. Because as you know, the typical way we infer generalizability from a research project is to have a representative sample drawn from a larger population and randomly drawn at that. That almost never happens. Not even in the biggest of experiments. You could have 1,000 people, but it's extremely unlikely they're going to be randomly drawn from a larger population of interest. It's virtually impossible. So the generalizability of group experiments is not a function of sample size, but of representativeness, and that almost is never possible to gather people randomly from a larger population of interest. Now, single system designs, of course, obviously these people aren't selected randomly. And the way we get around this in single system design and in group research designs is we're trying to demonstrate generalizability through the miracle of replication. You do the study again and see if you get the same results. Then other people do the study again and see if these independent researchers get the same results. Then you do the study in different contexts and in different populations and so forth. And each successful replication of a positive finding enhances the confidence we have that, yes, this intervention may really work. And that applies to both single system designs and group designs. Don't let anybody tell you that group designs have greater generalizability. They don't, unless their sample was randomly drawn from a larger population of interest, and that is virtually impossible to do.
Well, Bruce, for me personally, this is very exciting to think about the possibilities for kind of rigorous evaluation of what you're doing with your clients. And those clients, of course, could be communities. It could be, there could be, as you were talking about, policy issues, and to think about them being publishable if that's something that people want.
Yeah, I would encourage people listening to this podcast, if they're MSW or BSW students, to contemplate trying to use these designs in their internship. If they're a doctoral student, think about trying to use them to evaluate your own client work, or maybe do secondary analysis of existing agency data that can be formatted retrospectively in the form of a single subject design. And in some cases, I would encourage people who try this type of study to submit them to the many, many journals that welcome these types of designs to help us build a knowledge base of our field. And I'd like to conclude with some quotes and see if their listeners can guess who said these following three statements. Here's the first quote: "Every treatment is an experiment." End of quote. Here's the next quote: "In work with individuals, averages mean very little." End of quote. And then here's the long one. Quote, "Special efforts should be made to ascertain whether abnormal manifestations are increasing or decreasing in number and intensity, as this often has a practical bearing on the management of the case." Now, I won't ask you if you know who said this, Jonathan, but I will tell you that it was said by Mary Richmond in her classic 1917 book called Social Diagnosis.
So over 100 years ago, somebody basically said, go do single system design.
Not just somebody, Jonathan. Mary Richmond, the founder of clinical social work.
Those are amazing quotes to end with. Thank you. So thank you, Bruce, so much for being here on the podcast and talking with us about single system design.
It's been my great pleasure. I appreciate being asked, and I hope the listeners learned something.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.